Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be doing this talk for the Global Studies program at UC Irvine. So one focus of my research has been sovereign debt and debt crises, particularly in the Global South. And what I want to do today is just pretty simply reflect on some of the ways that sovereign debt dynamics are exacerbating the problems of the COVID pandemic and vice versa. In addition to the astounding public health toll, the pandemic has also caused massive economic devastation all over the world. But that devastation has been very uneven. So in wealthy countries, the crisis has fortunately been at least partly cushioned by a sharp increase in public spending, financed in large part through taking on lots of new debt. So the Institute for International Finance, for example, estimates that debt among advanced nations has soared to something like 432% of gross domestic product. In low and middle income countries, the situation has been very, very different. And the financial news has been full of stories like this one. So while the immediate health impacts of the virus have varied a lot across the global South, the economic crisis is already deepening in most of the low and middle income world as a result not just of lockdowns, but also of declines in tourism, in remittances, and trade revenues, and foreign domestic investment. And all of this is leading to sharp increases in unemployment, poverty, and hunger. Meanwhile, both the public health and other costs of the pandemic are being exacerbated by a deepening debt crisis in much of the global South. This debt crisis constrains government spending and access to new financing, while the pandemic and the associated economic crises in turn are making the debt crises in these places even worse. So I want to try today to answer a deceptively simple question, which is simply, how has COVID-19 exacerbated the problem of sovereign debt in the developing world? Now, I say this is deceptively simple because to my mind, this is not simply a question of rising debt levels or sort of numbers, but rather requires us to understand also how the contemporary sovereign debt system works, and why it is that the way it was set up in the 1980s has limited the possibilities for meaningful action on debt relief now. So my main goal today is to give you a sense of the scope of these problems and also to try to tease out how we got where we are today. The outline of the talk is roughly as follows. I'll first sort of describe the current sovereign debt governance system. I'll then talk more specifically about debt in the time of COVID. And then I'll talk specifically about the one debt relief initiative that's been put forward so far, which is something called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And I'll talk a lot about its limits. Specifically, my argument is that the DSSI is sort of fundamentally flawed because it excludes a significant of debt owed by foreign sovereign governments in the global South to private commercial creditors on the one hand, and to certain Chinese institutions on the other. And I'll talk about both aspects of that. So what is sovereign debt? I'm going to start with a few basic definitions, and I apologize if this is too simple for some of you, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So sovereign debt can be most simply defined as money borrowed by national governments, and this can be from other governments. This is known as official bilateral credit, from international institutions, most importantly, the IMF and the World Bank, from private creditors, like banks, investment funds, or even retail investors or individuals. So it can be from any of these sources, and it can be in the form either of bank loans or actually more often of bonds. So bonds are sort of financial instruments that governments issue and sell on international markets. So sovereign debt works very differently for wealthy and poorer countries. So for wealthy countries, as a rule, you can often borrow in your own currency. Okay? So the United States borrows in dollars at pretty low interest rates. Now, low and middle income countries, in contrast, almost always have to borrow in foreign currencies, most importantly, US dollars, although that can also be in Japanese yen. and invariably at significantly higher interest rates than wealthy countries borrow at. So this makes sovereign debt burdens for low and middle income countries much harsher, much heavier than they are for wealthy countries, even when they have the same amount of debt. And as in general, low and middle income countries actually don't borrow especially more debt. They don't take out more debt as a ratio of debt to GDP than wealthy countries. However, because they're borrowing at higher interest rates and in a foreign currency, that debt service burden is much higher. Now, since the 1980s, despite this, poor countries around the world have been increasingly dependent on borrowing from foreign sources in order to do all sorts of things, like fund basic government services and development projects in particular. This sort of borrowing, however, combined with both domestic and international economic issues throughout this period, has led to repeated sovereign debt crises concentrated mostly in the developing world since the 1980s. So here you can see the sharp increase in banking crises from the 1980s on. So what happens when you get a crisis, a debt crisis? Generally, and this often only happens after quite a lot of economic pain for the indebted country, you eventually get to some kind of debt restructuring. So debt restructurings typically do two things. First, they involve some reduction of the total amount of debt, and this is a reduction to both, can be a reduction to the principals or the underlying amount of the debt and or to the interest payments on that debt. And they also typically involve an exchange of old debts, either old loans or especially old bonds, for new debts with longer maturity. So if you had a bunch of debt due in 10 years, you might, during a restructuring, exchange that debt for new bonds that are not due for another 20 or 30 years. But how much reduction do you get during a debt restructuring, and when exactly in the context of the crisis do you get that debt reduction, and who oversees this? So the most important thing to know about the international debt restructuring system is that there is none, which is to say there is no formal international debt restructuring system. Instead, what we have is a system of case-by-case negotiations, is how they're often referred to, or ad hoc negotiations, where in every individual case, debtors and creditors sort of get together and negotiate what that debt restructuring will look like. Now, this works differently for debt that's held by other governments, so that what I referred to earlier as official bilateral creditors, than it does for debt held by private creditors. So for debt held by other governments, these negotiations are usually handled through an informal organization called the Paris Club, which is a group of mostly countries from the global north, as well as, with a few exceptions, you can see highlighted on the map here. For debt held by major international institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, where there is a debt restructuring, that's usually done through more direct bilateral negotiations with that institution. Now, most important for my talk today is what happens to debt that's held by private creditors, so by banks or hedge funds or investment funds of other sorts. So for debt owed to private creditors, the international debt system essentially operates through three basic tiers. So in the first tier, you have the debt contract itself, so contracts between debtor countries and private creditors, and every loan or bond is essentially a contract. Now, those contracts are governed almost always not by the law of the country that's issuing debt, the country that's taking on debt, but rather by foreign law. For low and middle income countries, this is usually by US and sometimes by English law. Now, in the event of a crisis, what happens is that you get a case-by-case debt restructuring in which the IMF generally comes in and tries to manage a really complicated negotiation between all of the private creditors who hold a country's debt and that debtor. Now, what's critical here is that since the 1980s, these debt restructurings have in practice been mandatory for debtors. And they're mandatory in the sense that basically, if a debtor refuses to participate in a debt restructuring like this, it will be excluded from international financial markets and will have a very, very difficult time getting new loans. In contrast, these case-by-case debt restructurings are strictly voluntary for private creditors. And this is an explicit part of the way that these case-by-case debt restructurings work. One primary effect of this, and it's an intended effect of this, is to make it possible for private creditors to refuse to participate in debt restructurings and instead to take their claims to court. And essentially, that means that they take their claims to court wherever the governing law is, so most often in US or English courts. So this is known as holdout litigation. So holdout litigation sort of closes the loop then and brings the sovereign debt governance regime for privately held debt back to the contracts between the country and the private creditor and to the enforcement of those contract terms by US or English courts. Now, all of this, the fact that it's a case-by-case approach and that it's always voluntary for private creditors, that there's no binding legal mechanism for making private creditors participate, is framed by its proponents as being more or less in line with market logics and rationalities. So being voluntary rather than binding here is seen as a key component of operating within the logic of free market capitalism. So what have the effects of this debt regime been? By and large, it's led to harsher debt restructurings since the 1980s when it was put in place. Now, this is due to a few different things. One, to the growing proportion of private to official creditors. So as more and more debt, especially for lower income countries, is now held by private creditors rather than official creditors, more and more of them are subjected to this governance regime in which private creditors are able to use that holdout litigation technique to sort of exact more from debtors during negotiations. It's also due to the fact that not only are there more private creditors now, but there is a growing diversity among private creditors. So in the 1970s, most private creditors making loans to foreign governments were banks, but today that's not the case. Today there are tens of thousands of different private creditors involving various kinds of financial institutions, especially hedge funds and mutual funds and increasingly pension funds as well. And these creditors have sort of different goals and strategies. And so it's been harder and harder to get them to agree in these debt restructurings on a negotiated outcome. And this has in turn helped increase the amount of holdout litigation. At the same time, there have been a series of specific legal changes in US law and English law that have bolstered the power of holdouts in this sort of litigation. And there were a few particularly striking holdout successes against Greece and Argentina in the 2010s. So while there have been some improvements in the sense that there have been new contractual approaches in some cases that have helped deter litigation in recent restructurings, these holdout successes over the last 30 years and especially in the 2010s have led many experts to argue that more and more creditors are actually pursuing holdout litigation rather than participating in these restructurings. And many of these types of funds, the types of funds who tend to pursue that kind of holdout litigation, have already been snapping up what's known as distressed sovereign debt in the context of the pandemic. So these distressed debt specialists are investment funds that buy debt only after a crisis has started. So they are not funds that lend to a country in any sort of meaningful way. Rather, once a crisis has started and the debt of that country is trading at very low prices, these investors come in and buy that debt, often at, say, sort of 20 cents on the dollar, in order to be able to pursue either a very strong restructuring in terms of the creditor's perspective, or to pursue a holdout strategy in Western courts. Now, the commitment to this existing framework, and specifically to the idea that participation for private creditors should always be voluntary, has also prevented several attempts to create alternatives to this existing sovereign debt governance regime. Including most famously, this has hindered an effort by the IMF itself to create a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which would have been binding on all parties in 2001. And more recently, a 2014 effort by the UN General Assembly calling for a multilateral legal framework for sovereign debt restructuring. Both efforts were defeated by private sector and creditor country opposition. In both cases, the arguments used against them were made in the language of saying that these would be too binding and that they would therefore interfere with private markets. Okay, so that in a nutshell is how the current sovereign debt regime works. So now I want to return to the question I opened with, which is, what does this all mean for debt in the time of COVID? In other words, how was COVID and the accompanying economic recession affecting sovereign debt in the global south in the context of this overarching debt framework? My argument is that this requires looking not just at debt in the past year and a half, but in the past several years leading up to the pandemic, and that it requires understanding how this institutional framework that was set up in the 1980s continues to shape the possibilities for sovereign debt governance today. So to start with, sort of thinking about trends in sovereign debt over the last 10 or 15 years, look at a few charts here. So here we see that since around 2010, debt levels have been rising in low-income and middle-income countries around the world. So in this graph, we see debt increases for Africa and Latin America. And what you see is an increase in external debt for both of these regions, even as exports have declined. Now, this increase in debt has been driven in part by the economic needs or desires of those countries for loans. And on the creditor side, it's been driven by a search for high yields because these debts are high risk and high interest rates, they offer much higher returns for investors than, say, Europe, UK, or English or US debt. And so creditors have actually flocked to these emerging or frontier markets because they're higher risk during this time. Now, at the same time, because there's rising debt levels, while you also have a steep decline in exports of goods, this has made debt service burdens even worse because it's been even harder to get the dollars needed to pay back those loans. There have also been really important changes in creditor composition during the same time period. And so here I want to look at another chart that lays some of this out. So this chart here shows creditors, how much sovereign debt is held and by what kinds of creditors for 73 of the lowest income countries in the world since 1990. And there's a few key things to notice. So first, we see that there's a big spike in total debt levels from around 2007 on. Right, here. Now we also, second, see the growing relative importance of China from 2014 on in this sort of dark or gray-blue band. And in these top, here we also see in these sort of third and fourth bars down, and increasing the importance of commercial lenders and bondholders in sovereign debt. Finally, in the top two bars here in the light gray and light yellow, we also see that there's been an even steeper increase in commercial loans to businesses within these countries. That debt is not held, it does not currently count as sovereign debt exactly. However, much of that debt is guaranteed by the host country, and thus it's likely to become sovereign debt during a crisis. And I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A if people are interested. Now, the shift in creditor composition has meant that this means that this rise in total debt stocks has also led to an even more rapid increase in what are called debt service levels. So because commercial creditors and some Chinese lenders charge higher interest rates than either the multilateral development banks or most Western bilateral creditors, as the total amount of debt held by those creditors goes up, the debt service burden, the amount that's actually being paid in any given year on the debt, goes up as well. So this chart here shows increasing debt service burden for low-income countries. It shows that that burden has grown from around $20 billion a year in 2015 to over $40 billion a year since 2019. And again, just to reiterate here, even as debts have been rising in much of the global south, growth has been slowing in many of these same countries, dragged down in part by stagnant and declining exports, as well as by reduced commodity prices. So the upshot of all this was that by 2018, the IMF and the World Bank were already warning of looming debt distress in many countries. Sub-Saharan Africa was particularly vulnerable. Nigeria, Ghana, and Angola by this time were dedicating more than 40% of government revenue to interest payments, and Zambia and Kenya were not far behind. The pandemic has seriously exacerbated this already pretty dire situation. It's creating huge difficulties for low and middle income countries. So the World Bank estimates that 50% of the lowest income countries in the world are now at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. And here in light blue, you can see the number of countries with their debt trading in distressed territory. The World Bank also estimates that an increasing number of emerging market economies, so not only the lowest income countries, but many middle income emerging market countries as well, have entered distressed debt territory too. At least 6 countries have already restructured since the pandemic began. And the IMF recently concluded that the crisis is likely to wipe out 10 years of progress in development in sub-Saharan Africa. And all this has direct effects not only on developing country economies in general, but on healthcare and responses to the pandemic as well. So even before the pandemic, many low-income countries were spending more on debt service than on healthcare, which you can see here in this chart, that the countries, the dots above the line represent countries who are spending more on debt service than they are on healthcare as a percentage of GDP. And this was already leading to systematic underinvestment in healthcare systems and capacities. The worsening of debt burdens as a result of the pandemic is only making this worse. Just to give you one example, the UK-based Jubilee Debt Campaign recently calculated that as a whole, Africa is now spending 3 times more on debt repayments to banks and speculators than it would cost to vaccinate the entire continent against COVID-19. So what's being done about this? There's widespread recognition that there is a really serious problem here, that the pandemic is exacerbating inequalities around the world, including these kinds of debt-based inequalities. So what's happened so far? Well, there have been a number of crisis initiatives. Mostly we've seen emergency financing through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. This is probably good, although it does also increase debt burdens in the long run for many countries. However, there's only been one debt relief initiative so far, and that's the COVID-19 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or the DSSI. This initiative has been loudly praised by the World Bank, the IMF, and bilateral creditors. Yet it is also widely criticized both by financial experts and by debt activists for its limits. And the main point I want to make about it today is that the limits of the DSSI are not just a product of poor policymaking now or in the last couple of years. Rather, they are the result of the structural limitations put in place by the sovereign debt governance regime I described earlier in the talk. Focusing on the DSSI and its flaws, I think, helps highlight broader problems with this regime. Most strikingly, the fact that it insists on making the participation of private creditors in debt restructurings voluntary. So how does the DSSI work? I'll just talk through a couple of basics here. Basically, what it does is it offers temporary debt service deferral for payments to official G20 bilateral creditors. So the G20 includes Japan, the US, the UK, Canada, the EU, and China, most importantly. It defers those payments, so these are basically interest payments, through December 2021. Countries will then have to repay that debt service, but they can sort of spread those debt payments over the next 5 years. There are 73 low-income eligible debtors in the world. And there's an estimated $13 billion of eligible debt. Of that, around $5.7 billion in debt relief has been granted so far. So debtors who take on this debt relief, who accept this debt service suspension, are required to do a few things. First, they have to formally request the relief, so this doesn't just get given to countries automatically. They're required to use the funds for pandemic response, and the IMF in particular has been involved in monitoring those countries to try to make sure that they do that. They're also required to forego any new market rate lending during the suspension period. So they're not allowed, during the period in which they are taking this DSSI relief, countries are not allowed to take new market loans from private creditors. So, this is not a hugely generous program, but it's something, but it has several serious flaws as well. For one, it's only debt service deferral, not outright relief. So it doesn't lead to any reduction in the total principal of debt or even in the amount of interest paid. It just delays the time that that interest has to be paid in. It also really significantly excludes middle income emerging economies. And a lot of people have critiqued it for this reason, because many of these middle income economies are themselves in dire need of debt relief during the pandemic. It also excludes debt owed to multilateral development institutions like the World Bank. Most fundamentally, in my opinion, it excludes debt owed to commercial creditors. Although creditor governments that have participated in the DSSI have encouraged commercial lenders to participate, there has been no attempt to make them do so. Participating in this debt restructuring creditors, just like it has been in all sovereign debt restructurings since the 1980s. So the limits of the DSSI are really especially clear if we look more closely at creditor composition for DSSI eligible countries. And this chart here shows debt service payments due by creditor category for these countries in 2020 and 2021. So this is payments on either principal or interest that are due in these 2 years. Now, what it shows is that the total debt service due for these countries in just these 2 years is about $85 billion. So this means that the $13 billion of relief of debt eligible for relief under the DSSI is really only a small part of that. The $5.7 billion that has actually been granted is an even smaller percentage. Now, those amounts are so small because it doesn't include debt owed to the IMF, the World Bank, and other development banks, which we can see here are these bottom 2 rows, is a pretty significant amount of the debt service owed. It also doesn't include bonds or commercial bank loans, which are in these top 3 rows here. Those commercially held loans add up to about 12% of the total debt stock held by these countries, but also about a nearly 1/3 of interest payments. Now, it only includes some of the debt labeled here as held by Chinese official creditors, and I'll come back to why in a few minutes, and that's been a source of contention. Okay, so the upshot of all this is that the DSSI only applies, even in theory, to a pretty small percentage of low-income country debt payments in these 2 years. And only 46 of the 73 eligible DSSI countries have even taken up the offer at all. Why is that? Well, among other reasons, it's because the DSSI limits countries who take this relief from accepting new market rate loans, as I mentioned. So for those who can still access private markets, this limited debt relief is really not seen as worth the trade-off of forgoing more financing in the middle of a pandemic. Moreover, there's evidence already that just accepting relief under the DSSI initiative will lead to credit downgrades from the major ratings agencies, downgrades which will make any future borrowing for these countries more expensive. This has made many countries unwilling to even apply for this relief. This fear is even more acute when it comes to asking private creditors to participate in the program. Now, only a few countries have even attempted this, have even asked for this participation, and so far, no private creditor has agreed. The amount held by these private creditors amounts to around $24 billion in debt service for DSSI countries in this 2-year period. And so that amount is not being considered for relief at all. As the IMF admitted in 2021, although they appreciated the International Institute of Finance's statement that private creditors would consider participating in this program, private sector participation had been limited so far, which is to say pretty much non-existent. Now, another $19 billion or so of the money owed by the DSSI eligible countries is owed to China, and this is in a fuzzier category. So the role of China in the DSSI highlights some of the problems with the existing international debt system in some interesting ways. When we're thinking about international lenders and debt-driven development in the global south, China is a very interesting case now. So as I'm sure you all know, China is or was until recently considered a developing country, and it was allied in various ways throughout the latter half of the 20th century with other countries across the global south. More recently, however, China has experienced extraordinary economic growth and is now one of the most important lenders to other low and middle income countries. So you can see in this graph that it now outlends all other major governments by quite a lot. You can see in the green line here is debt owed to China versus the pink line showing debt owed to Paris Club governments. China holds about 1/6 of the total debt stock of emerging market and developing economies' debts, and it holds about 1/5 of the total debt stock of African countries that are eligible for DSSI. Now, if we go back to this chart, we see that debt service to China accounts for over 25% of all debt service owed by DSSI eligible countries in both 2020 and 2021. So this all makes China, of course, extremely important in any widespread debt relief effort today. And in fact, China has been an important participant in the DSSI. It's actually granted about half of that $5.7 billion in debt relief so far dispersed under the initiative. Nevertheless, that is only a fraction of the debt described here as being owed to Chinese official creditors. So why? Why is that? Well, here we see that you see this term World Bank definition after these two categories, Chinese commercial banks and Chinese official bilateral creditors. Why is that there? Well, China and the World Bank have been fighting over how to characterize some of China's lenders. Under the DSSI, China has already deferred payment on debt held by its Export-Import Bank, which China agrees is an official lender. A lot of the rest, however, is held by other Chinese institutions, including some that the World Bank agrees are commercial, that's in this thin yellow band in this chart, but also a big chunk by an institution called the Chinese Development Bank, the China Development Bank. Excuse me. So the CDB, or the China Development Bank, is not important in all countries. However, it's very important for others, for example, in Angola, which is currently facing a really major debt crisis. And Angola owes China as a whole at least $2.67 billion now. It's this China Development Bank that is at the focus of the dispute between China and Western countries. So the World Bank basically insists that the China Development Bank is an official creditor, and therefore that debt service to the CDB should be waived under the DSSI initiative. Now, China, in contrast, insists that the China Development Bank is a commercial bank, just like any other commercial bank, and has said that it will encourage the CDB to offer relief, just like other governments are encouraging their commercial creditors to do, which is to say with no success. Now, my point here is not to weigh in on whether or not the CDB is really public or private. I would say that the CDB is legitimately a hybrid institution that could arguably be defined either way. According to its own website, it focuses on infrastructure development and poverty alleviation, among other things, and it is also under the direct leadership of the State Council of China. However, it is also a for-profit institution that lends at market rather than concessional interest rates in order to make a profit. The World Bank's own definitions are also ambiguous on this point. So the World Bank itself has said that all commercial banks, whether publicly owned or not, are classified as private creditors for the purposes of sovereign debt governance. Although in other places it says that official bilateral creditors include all public institutions in which the government share is 50% or above. So those definitions are actually not especially helpful here. So my point, as I said, is not to weigh in on whether or not this is really public or really private. Rather, my point is that this struggle between the World Bank and the CDB over how these lenders should be characterized highlights the fundamental flaw at the heart of the entire sovereign debt governance regime. Basically, as China becomes an this public-private distinction only matters because of the way the current sovereign debt governance regime works. Right? Specifically because of its insistence on ensuring that all private creditor participation remains strictly voluntary. So what China is essentially doing here is taking advantage of the existing categories under which the sovereign debt governance regime operates. So where does that leave us? Well, the story of COVID and debt is still unfolding, and so I'm not going to draw any grand conclusions about the ultimate effects of COVID on sovereign debt in the Global South. But I will make a few provisional points here. First, that the DSSI example makes clear that whether in relation to Chinese creditors or to Western commercial creditors, the refusal to require all creditors to participate in debt relief programs has doomed these debt relief efforts from the start, even on their own terms, I would say. This is not just a policy failure of the current moment or sort of bad decision-making in the current moment. Rather, it's really just the latest, although an especially devastating example of the problems with the debt governance system that was set up in the 1980s. And that has been upheld by the United States and many other Western governments ever since. So debt levels in low and middle income countries were already rising before the pandemic. Since the pandemic began, debt service payments and limits on financing options have severely restricted the ability of these countries to respond to both the health and economic dimensions of the pandemic in the way that wealthy countries have been able to. Now, even as vaccines, themselves, of course, far less accessible to many low-income countries, allow a gradual return to normal life in some places over the next few years, the failure to offer any real debt relief will undoubtedly increase the severity of both the immediate public health emergency and of the economic damage to come, and spur further vicious cycles of borrowing and crisis. In short, without a massive overhaul, and I would argue specifically without an international framework that is binding on all creditors, private and public, no meaningful response to the debt burdens dragging down societies across much of the Global South is possible. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions in person.